So let's go through kind of the potential impact or the potential ways that people can break in security deployments. So I wonder if any of you remember that Mirai botnet. That was a major type of attack that was first known in around October 2016. It was the first of its kind to use compromised IP cameras and DVRs into a botnet army, typically infecting a bunch of IoT devices by using their default credentials. So then those botnet armies, they're used to launch denial of service attacks, so bringing entire networks or websites down, or perform a massive spamming campaign. So there's a new trend that we should be very concerned about, is that this Mirai botnet, as you can see here on the screen, there's now tons of variants that we've seen reappearing last year. So just duplicating itself into all these variants that are engineered to infect our enterprise IoT devices. And beyond cameras, we're talking wireless presentation systems or digital advertising screens, anything that's connected somehow. They can access to greater bandwidth connections that are available through those devices, therefore allowing them for much greater power for those DDoS attacks. So especially in the last few months, we've seen even that those types of attacks have tripled in the second quarter of 2020. That's from Kaspersky, that was released recently. So the experts at Kaspersky research firm is that they think that the increase is actually because during the pandemic, millions of people have opted to work from home. So as Mathieu said earlier, we're exposing more devices, more endpoints, and PC, like employee devices to the internet without properly securing them, right? So we're boosting the usage of many technologies, connected technologies, and therefore having this massive jump of DDoS attack, because the hackers are always going to leverage any sort of situation. So what about our industry a bit more specifically? We've done a research actually at Genetec on the usage of firmware, camera firmware in the field, to see which ones were out of date. So we've concluded that research with 68% of cameras actually being out of date. So almost 7 out of 10 are running out of date firmware, and then more than half of these actually contain a known vulnerability. So this is the even more alarming portion. That means that in an average VMS system, that nearly 4 out of 10 cameras are vulnerable to a cyber attack, right? So that's way too many. So all it takes to get into a system, a network, could be a single camera with obsolete firmware or a default password that creates a direct opening. It allows the attackers to compromise the network or private data. So we really need to become better at this, maintaining our fleet of cameras. And later on during this presentation, and also next week, we will show you better ways of doing that. But before that, we're going to expand a bit on this topic. So many of you have asked for an update on the status of risky or untrusted devices. So yes, there's been a lot of action in the market and within governments to either ban or stop working with certain technology vendors. So recently, the Dublin City Council, they had installed Hikvision cameras with artificial intelligence, allowing for facial recognition. But there was no data protection impact assessment. So just to evaluate the potential impact on private information, that was not conducted as per GDPR. So they had to remove those cameras, also because of the general unease around Hikvision. And recently, we've also seen UnVIF ban Hikvision and Dawa. They're actually blocked from conforming UnVIF products. This means that no new products or updated firmware from old products can be conformant with UnVIF, essentially blocking from RFPs requiring UnVIF conformance. And then the France Cybersecurity Agency, ANSSI and SSI, said this month that they would allow operators to continue using Huawei equipment under licenses of 3 to 8 years, but they announced that, France announced that they will be stopping the use or banning such devices by 2028. So ANSI again urges telcos that are not currently using those devices to avoid switching to those devices. And UK also said they would ban Huawei by the end of 2027. And then a bit further east, same thing goes in Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So first in 2018, the Australian government has announced a national security-based decision to prevent foreign vendors from taking part into the rollout of 5G mobile networks. Effectively, they banned those networking giants, Huawei and ZTE, from being involved. And a bit later, New Zealand and Japan have done the same. So this is really becoming kind of a global trend. And an event we wanted to point out here was a couple of years ago that there was the Chinese government spying on the African Union, essentially inserting a backdoor in the headquarters security system. So they gave a free security system there, and every night the private data was being transferred to servers back in Shanghai. So this, of course, was followed by a layoff of engineers at the HQ and a complete replacement of the system, just adding a bit more to this controversy. And then, as you probably know, U.S. government has banned the use of those devices, with the HR 5515 bill. And finally, to complete this map, there's two security giants, Honeywell and Johnson Controls, who recently decided to stop doing business with Hikvision. So we were seeing this all in all as a massive trend, not because there's cybersecurity issues directly with those devices. Like it's not so much about that. It's more about the trust assessment of those vendors and some worries about the ethical human rights violation that we've seen. So many events in the last few years have led to this kind of global trend that we're seeing here. So in order to properly assess the risk here, we're going to address some misconceptions that really directly affect our industry. First thing that you've probably heard many times before is that nobody cares about those security devices. So some people will say my cameras or my devices are not a prime target. Nobody cares about seeing my backyard or my warehouse. Another common argument is that my system is not connected. It has an air gap, or I've been using this very stable legacy product for so many years, it's offline, it gives me peace of mind. And then we get the classic, I don't care what's behind it as long as I get a secure final product with proper cyber protection. So let's go through each of these arguments and see why they're absolutely false. So about this first one, it is true that attackers often do not care about the camera itself or your backyard, right? They care about the interconnectivity, the processing power, everything that they can get through that entry point. So again, every single device with processing power can be used as a point of entry. And 90% of all IoT attacks last year were through routers and connected cameras. So they can cause a lot of damage to a much greater extent to security installations out there. And of course, that interconnectivity is going to multiply the vulnerabilities because they can join vulnerabilities together to leverage into their cyber engineering campaigns. And then with so many people and things trying to connect, they must first earn your trust. That's really the basis of this conversation, properly assessing the trust of every vendor, of every partner. And it's very important to apply this concept before you allow anything to connect to your network, to your system. So then the classic perimeter defense strategy, which is clearly not a viable strategy, because having valuable things and trying to protect them by simply putting this digital barrier, it tends to fail. And when it fails, it will most likely fail catastrophically. So let's look at why this is the case very quickly. So malicious insiders or trusted insiders, they are a very serious security threat. That's over half of all data breaches. So we need to focus not only on privileged users like system admins or operators, but also contractors or temporary workers, service providers, because stolen credentials are very common. And once they get access to these systems, it doesn't matter if they're connected to the internet or not. They're simply exploiting shared or weak passwords, unsecured devices and networks. So they will find a way around those static defenses. And then lateral movement, which is closely linked to what we're talking about here. That's the concept of slowly crawling within a network. So they're searching for key data, a credential, or an asset that is ultimately the target of their attack campaign, right? One very popular technique here is the credentials dumping. So for example, they find a default admin account somewhere, a default password, and then they will get into the VPN with those stolen credentials, and then they will jump from one system to another and go deeper in the network as they learn about the network topology. And finally, they will get to confidential data, steal money from the ATM system, maybe a week or a month after. And then we have the infected devices, right? That good old USB stick. So all it takes is a single infected device. We've seen some tests being done where they would drop USB sticks a bit everywhere in parking lots or in corridors. And almost every single USB stick was picked up because people love those free things. And then 45% of them were plugged in computers. This just means that without proper education on cyber hygiene, this can be a very harmful device. And then there's the physical network access. That one's even easier. So they can use Wi-Fi trapping devices, intercept wireless signals. They can use even that Ethernet cable hanging around and just connecting to your network, giving access to anyone nearby the building. So now let's go into that third argument, which is supply chain risk is primordial. We need to do a proper assessment of that risk. We need to manage that risk because even with the strongest defense layers, you need to think the before and after. You need to assess the entire supply chain because this globally interconnected supply chain is highly vulnerable to a new kind of attack, which is the supply chain attack, right? Often we'll assume that all parties trust each other, but we all need to do our homeworks. We need to vet every link in the chain. There's been a steady increase in supply chain attacks. And just a few examples here of what we mean by supply chain attack. For example, hardware processors themselves can be used to do a cyber attack or steal information from the kernel memory in those processors, for example. We saw that about 2 years ago with virtually every processor being affected by this vulnerability. And then also malicious hardware or software being inserted in products before they are shipped to surveillance deployments. So we saw backdoor access to security cameras or entire bank websites that were hijacked and spoofed for hours. And then this resulted in millions of dollars being stolen. So all in all, after these, the goal here is to, of course, change the conversation, like defeat those persisting arguments and help our customers ask the right questions before they partner with anyone.